The fluorescent lights in family courtroom 3B hummed with a kind of persistent buzz that makes your teeth ache. Sarah Martinez sat alone at the plaintiff's table, her fingers tracing the worn leather binding of her grandmother's journal, the only thing she had left from a childhood that now felt like someone else's memory. Behind her, in the gallery's front row, her parents whispered conspiratorially with her ex-husband, Marcus, their heads bent together like old friends, sharing secrets at a dinner party she hadn't been invited to. The irony wasn't lost on her. This was supposed to be her day in court, her chance to finally tell the truth about what had really happened during those 3 years of marriage. Instead, she felt like a stranger in her own story, watching her family choose the man who had systematically destroyed her over the daughter who had survived him. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the morning's tension like a blade through silk. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady beneath her navy blue dress, the same dress she'd worn to college graduation when her parents had still looked at her with pride instead of disappointment. The fabric felt different now, heavier, as if it carried the weight of every argument, every sleepless night, every moment she'd spent questioning her own sanity over the past 2 years. Judge Hendricks was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the courtroom with practiced efficiency. She had a reputation for fairness, Sarah's lawyer had assured her, but also for having little patience for what she perceived as frivolous domestic disputes. Sarah prayed this wouldn't be dismissed as just another bitter divorce playing out in public. "I'll be seated," Judge Hendricks commanded, settling into her chair with the authority of someone who had heard every possible variation of human dysfunction. "We are here today for the matter of Martinez versus Rodriguez, regarding allegations of domestic abuse, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to be extinguished. Sarah glanced over at Marcus, sitting confidently at the defendant's table with his expensive lawyer, a man whose retainer alone probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months at the veterinary clinic where she worked. Marcus looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago. Perfectly styled dark hair, the kind of smile that had charmed her parents from the moment she'd brought him home, and those brown eyes that could switch from warm honey to cold amber in the space of a heartbeat. He was wearing the blue tie she'd given him for their first anniversary, and the sight of it made her stomach clench. Everything about him was calculated, from his posture to his choice of accessories. He knew exactly what story he was trying to tell today. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Hendricks said, consulting her papers, "you're representing yourself today, I see." "No, Your Honor." Janet Chen stood up with the kind of quiet confidence that came from 20 years of fighting battles in courtrooms just like this one. "I'm representing Ms. Martinez. Janet Chen from Chen and Associates." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Janet, who had taken her case on a payment plan when no other lawyer would even return her calls. Janet was a small woman with short black hair streaked with premature gray and a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. She had spent months preparing for this day, combing through medical records, financial statements, and police reports with the dedication of an archaeologist uncovering ancient truths. "Very well," Judge Hendricks nodded. "Mr. Rodriguez, I see you're represented by David Castellanos from Castellanos Wright and Partners."
"Yes, Your Honor." David Castellanos rose from his seat with the kind of theatrical flourish that made Sarah want to roll her eyes. He was everything she'd expected from Marcus's choice of lawyer. Expensive suit, perfect teeth, and the kind of confident swagger that came from winning cases through intimidation rather than justice. Behind Sarah, her mother Rosa whispered something to Marcus that made him nod sympathetically. The sound was like a physical blow, each word a reminder of how completely her family had turned against her. Her father, Miguel, sat stone-faced beside her mother, his weathered hands folded in his lap, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes when she turned around. These were the same people who had taught her to stand up for herself, to never let anyone treat her with disrespect. The same parents who had worked double shifts at the textile factory to pay for her education, who had cried with pride when she became the first person in their family to graduate from college. Now they sat in a courtroom, prepared to testify against her, convinced that their beloved son-in-law was the victim and their own daughter was the liar. "Ms. Chen," Judge Hendricks continued, "please present your opening statement." Janet stood, smoothing down her simple gray suit. "Thank you, Your Honor. Over the next few hours, we will present evidence that Mr. Rodriguez engaged in a systematic pattern of abuse against my client during their marriage. This abuse was not just physical, though the medical records will show clear evidence of that, but also psychological, financial, and emotional. We will demonstrate that Mr. Rodriguez isolated Ms. Martinez from her family and friends, controlled her access to money, and used manipulation tactics to convince everyone around them that she was unstable while presenting himself as the long-suffering husband." Sarah watched the faces in the gallery as Janet spoke. Marcus's sister, Alina, sat in the second row, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes fixed on Sarah with undisguised hostility. Next to Elena sat Father Rodriguez from St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Sarah and Marcus had been married 3 years ago in a ceremony that now felt like a cruel joke played by fate. "Furthermore," Janet continued, "we will show that Mr. Rodriguez's behavior didn't end with their divorce. He has continued to harass and intimidate Ms. Martinez, going so far as to turn her own family against her through a calculated campaign of lies and manipulation. The evidence will show that every injury Ms. Martinez sustained during their marriage was documented by medical professionals and that the pattern of abuse escalated over time in ways that are consistent with well-established domestic violence research." The courtroom was silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. Sarah felt exposed under the fluorescent lights, as if everyone could see through her skin to the scars underneath, some visible, others buried so deep they might never heal. David Castellanos rose for his opening statement, his smile never wavering. "Your Honor, what we have here is a troubled young woman who cannot accept the end of her marriage and is willing to fabricate serious allegations to punish my client for moving on with his life. The evidence will show that Ms. Martinez has a history of mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, which have been exacerbated by her inability to maintain stable relationships." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. The depression had come after months of Marcus telling her she was worthless, that no one would ever love her the way he did. The anxiety had developed from walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of her husband would come home each night. "My client is a respected member of the community," Castellanos continued, gesturing toward Marcus with the pride of a man showing off a prized possession. "He owns his own construction business, volunteers at his church, and has maintained strong relationships with Ms. Martinez's family even after their divorce. The medical records that Ms. Chen mentioned can easily be explained by Ms. Martinez's own clumsiness and tendency towards self-harm during her depression episodes." The words hit Sarah like a physical slap. Self-harm? As if she had broken her own ribs, given herself the black eyes that took weeks to heal, caused the concussion that had left her dizzy and nauseous for months. The worst part was seeing her mother nod slightly at
Castellanos' words, as if they confirmed something she had always suspected about her daughter. "The truth, Your Honor," Castellanos concluded, "is that Miss Martinez is a bitter ex-wife who cannot move forward with her life and is determined to destroy my client's reputation rather than take responsibility for her own actions." Judge Hendricks made a note on her papers. "Thank you both. Ms. Chen, please call your first witness. I call Dr. Rebecca Martinez to the stand." Sarah's stomach dropped. Dr. Martinez, no relation despite the shared name, was the emergency room physician who had treated Sarah for what would be the last time during her marriage. It was Dr. Martinez who had first used the words domestic violence in Sarah's presence, who had gently but persistently asked the questions that Sarah wasn't ready to answer. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm demeanor that came from years of seeing humanity at its worst and still choosing compassion. She was sworn in quickly and settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone who had testified in court many times before. "Dr. Martinez," Janet began, "can you tell us about your encounter with the plaintiff on March 15, 2023? Ms. Martinez came into the emergency room around 11 p.m. with what appeared to be severe injuries to her torso and face. She had 3 broken ribs, extensive bruising, and a mild concussion. Sarah remembered that night with horrible clarity. Marcus had come home late from a business dinner that had left him smelling like perfume and cheap wine. When Sarah had asked about it, not accusingly, just curiously, he had exploded with a violence that had shocked them both. It was the first time he had hurt her badly enough to require medical attention, though it wouldn't be the last. In your professional opinion, were these injuries consistent with an accidental fall, as Miss Martinez initially claimed? Dr. Martinez shook her head. The pattern of injuries was consistent with intentional violence. The bruising on her ribs showed clear fingerprint patterns, and the facial injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly. Did you document these observations? I did. I also photographed the injuries with Miss Martinez's consent. Janet approached the witness stand with a manila folder. I'd like to enter these photographs into evidence as Exhibit A. Sarah closed her eyes as the photographs were passed to Judge Hendricks. She didn't need to see them again. The images were burned into her memory. Her face swollen beyond recognition, her torso a palette of purples and blues, her eyes vacant with the shock of realizing that the man who had promised to love and protect her was capable of such cruelty. Behind her, she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope that seeing the evidence would change something, would make her parents remember the daughter they had raised and loved. But when she turned around, her mother's face was unreadable, her father's expression unchanged. Dr. Martinez, Janet continued, in your experience, how common is it for domestic violence victims to initially lie about the source of their injuries? Extremely common. Studies show that victims typically deny abuse an average of 7 times before they're ready to seek help. The shame, fear, and isolation that characterizes abusive relationships makes it very difficult for victims to admit what's happening, even to medical professionals. David Castellanos objected to the testimony as speculative, but Judge Hendricks allowed it to stand. Sarah felt a small surge of hope. Maybe someone would finally listen to her story.
Long-suffering husband trying to protect his mentally ill wife from herself. Sarah was the dangerous, unstable woman who had forced him into an impossible situation. Mr. Rodriguez, Castellanos continued, how did Ms. Martinez's family react to these episodes? They were as concerned as I was, Marcus replied, glancing towards Sarah's parents with a look of shared understanding. Rosa and Miguel tried to help, tried to convince Sarah to get treatment, but she was resistant to help, convinced that everyone was against her. It was heartbreaking to watch. Sarah felt sick. This was why her parents had turned against her. Marcus had spent months, maybe years, preparing them for this moment. While she had been trying to heal from trauma, he had been carefully constructing an alternative narrative that painted him as the hero and her as the villain of their story. When Janet cross-examined Marcus, she was relentless, but professional, picking apart his timeline, questioning his explanations, forcing him to confront the medical evidence. But Marcus was prepared for every question, his answers consistent with the story he had crafted. Mr. Rodriguez, Janet said, you claim that Ms. Martinez's injuries were self-inflicted during a psychotic episode. Can you explain how someone would give themselves fingerprint bruises on their ribs? As I said, I had to restrain her to prevent her from hurting herself further. I was trying to help her. And the photographs show clear handprint patterns on her throat. How do you explain that? She was threatening to hurt herself. I had to physically prevent her from... So you're admitting that you put your hands on her throat? Marcus paused, his composure slipping slightly. I was preventing her from harming herself. Any reasonable person would have done the same thing. It was a small victory, but Sarah could see that it wasn't enough. The foundation of Marcus's story, that she was mentally unstable and he was trying to help her, remained intact. The gallery still saw him as the victim, her as the aggressor. As the afternoon wore on, character witnesses took the stand to testify about Marcus's good reputation in the community. Father Rodriguez spoke about his volunteer work at the church. His business partner testified about his professional integrity. His sister Elena painted a picture of a devoted family man who had been driven to desperation by his wife's erratic behavior. The most damaging testimony came from Sarah's own parents. Her mother took the stand with tears in her eyes, describing her daughter's personality changes during the marriage and her growing concern about Sarah's mental health.
She became paranoid, she testified, her voice thick with emotion. She stopped talking to us, stopped coming to family gatherings. When we tried to help, she would accuse us of taking Marcus's side. It broke our hearts. Sarah wanted to scream. She had stopped coming to family gatherings because Marcus had convinced her that her family didn't really want her there, that she was a burden and an embarrassment. She had become paranoid because she was living with someone who was systematically destroying her sense of reality. Her father's testimony was shorter, but equally devastating. Miguel spoke about his son-in-law's efforts to help Sarah get the treatment she needed, and his frustration with his daughter's refusal to acknowledge her problems. By the time court adjourned for the day, Sarah felt as if she had been flayed alive. The evidence was on her side, but the narrative belonged to Marcus. He had spent 2 years after their divorce carefully cultivating relationships with everyone who mattered, while she had been trying to piece herself together in isolation. Janet walked her to the parking garage, both women silent until they reached Sarah's ancient Honda Civic, a car she'd bought after Marcus had accidentally destroyed her previous car during one of his rages. "Tomorrow will be better," Janet said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Will it?" Sarah asked. "Did you see my parents' faces? They believe him. They actually believe that I'm the crazy one." "The evidence speaks for itself," Janet insisted. "Judge Hendricks is experienced with domestic violence cases. She knows what to look for." Sarah nodded, but as she drove home to her tiny apartment across town, she couldn't shake the feeling that the evidence might not be enough. Marcus had always been better at playing the long game, at crafting stories that made people want to believe him. In her rearview mirror, she could see her parents' car following Marcus's truck out of the parking garage. They would probably go to dinner together, commiserating about poor Sarah and her mental health issues. The daughter who had once made them proud was now the family's greatest shame, while the man who had nearly killed her was their beloved son-in-law. But as Sarah unlocked her apartment door and stepped into the safety of her own space, a space Marcus had never contaminated with his presence, she caught sight of her grandmother's journal on the kitchen table. Abuela Elena had been a woman who had survived poverty, immigration, and an abusive first husband to build a life of dignity and strength. She had written in that journal every day until arthritis made it impossible, recording not just events, but lessons, wisdom, and the kind of fierce hope that transcends circumstances. Sarah picked up the journal, running her fingers over the cracked leather binding. Tomorrow, she would return to that courtroom and face another day of having her truth questioned and her reality denied. But tonight, she would remember who she was before Marcus Rodriguez tried to erase her, and she would find the strength to keep fighting for the woman she was becoming. The fluorescent lights were still humming when she turned them off, but for the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep without checking the locks twice or looking over her shoulder. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had survived this far. That had to count for something. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through Sarah's dreams at 5:30 a.m., the same time she had been waking up for the past 2 years. Before Marcus, she had been a natural night owl who could barely function before 10 a.m., but living with him had required hyper-vigilance. She needed to be awake and alert before he started his day, needed to read his mood from the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the way he opened and closed cabinet doors, the tone of his voice when he said, "Good morning." Even now, 2 years after the divorce, her body maintained the same rigid schedule. Sarah rolled out of bed in her small apartment, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor that she had chosen specifically because it was nothing like the plush carpeting in the house she had once shared with Marcus. Every choice in her new life had been deliberate, a conscious rejection of the aesthetic he had imposed on their married life. Her morning routine was a meditation in reclamation. Coffee from a chipped mug she had bought at a garage sale. Marcus had insisted on matching dinnerware from expensive department stores. Oatmeal with cinnamon and honey. He had preferred elaborate breakfasts that required her to wake up even earlier to prepare. The morning news on a small television she had rescued from the thrift store. Their old house had boasted an entertainment system that cost more than most people's cars.
Every mundane choice was an act of rebellion against the woman she had been during their marriage, agreeable, accommodating, slowly disappearing into the shadow of her husband's larger-than-life personality. At 6:15, Sarah stepped outside her apartment to retrieve the newspaper from Mrs. Chen's doorstep next door. Mrs. Chen was 83 years old and had been living in the same unit for 40 years, watching the neighborhood change around her like a tree that bends with storms but never breaks. She had taken one look at Sarah when she moved in, hollow-eyed, jumping at sudden sounds, apologizing for everything, and had adopted her with the fierce protectiveness of someone who recognized a fellow survivor.
Morning, mija, Mrs. Chen called from her kitchen window, using the Spanish endearment she had learned from her late husband. You eaten enough? You look too skinny. It was the same conversation they had every morning, and Sarah treasured it for its predictability. Mrs. Chen worried about her weight, her sleep, whether she was dating anyone, normal concerns from someone who cared about her well-being without ulterior motives. I'm eating, Mrs. Chen, promise. Good. You need strength for today, yes? Big day at the court? Sarah had told her neighbor about the case in general terms, not the details, which felt too raw to share, but enough that Mrs. Chen understood this was important. The old woman had surprised her yesterday by pressing a small silver cross into her palm, explaining that it had belonged to her mother and carried protection for those who spoke truth in the face of lies. Yes, big day. You remember what I tell you about my first husband? Sarah smiled despite her nerves. Mrs. Chen had been married 3 times. First, to an abusive drunk who had died in a car accident when she was 25, then to a kind man who had passed away from cancer, and finally to Mr. Chen, who had loved her for 30 years before his own death 5 years ago. That he was a liar, and the world was better off without him. Smart girl. And what else? That truth has its own power, even when nobody wants to hear it. Especially when nobody wants to hear it, Mrs. Chen corrected. You go make your truth so loud they have to listen, yes? Sarah kissed the old woman's cheek through the window screen and tucked the silver cross into her purse next to her grandmother's journal. Armor for the battle ahead. The drive to the courthouse took her past the veterinary clinic, where she still worked, though her hours had been reduced since the court case began. Dr. Pearson had been understanding about her need for time off, but Sarah knew her distracted performance over the past months had strained their professional relationship. Yesterday's testimony had been supportive, but clinical, and she wondered if he regretted hiring someone who came with so much baggage. She also drove past the coffee shop where she had first met Marcus 4 years ago. It had been a cold Tuesday morning in November, and she had been running late for work after staying up all night studying for her veterinary technician certification exam. He had been in line behind her when she realized she had forgotten her wallet, and he had stepped forward with a smile that could have powered half the city to pay for her coffee. Let me, he had said in that warm voice that made her think of expensive whiskey and Sunday mornings. Beautiful women shouldn't have to worry about coffee money. It should have been a red flag. The assumption that her appearance was her primary value, the way he positioned himself as her rescuer from the start. But Sarah was 24 and working 2 jobs while going to school, and the gesture had felt genuinely kind. When he asked for her number, she gave it without hesitation. Marcus Rodriguez was a revelation in her young life. He owned his own construction company, drove a truck that always smelled like leather and cologne, and treated her like she was precious cargo that needed careful handling. He brought her flowers for no reason, took her to restaurants she had only driven past, and listened to her talk about her dreams of opening her own animal rescue someday with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. He had proposed after 6 months, presenting her with a diamond ring that caught the light like captured starfire. I know it's fast, he had said, dropping to one knee in her parents' living room while her mother cried happy tears and her father beamed with pride. But when you know, right? Sarah had said yes because everything in her life had suddenly felt like a fairy tale. The boy from her high school who had never noticed her was suddenly interested now that she was dating a successful businessman. Her parents, who had worried about her prospects as a single woman focused on her career, were thrilled that she had found such a catch. Her friends envied her the ring, the attention, the way Marcus looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. The wedding had been everything Sarah had dreamed of as a little girl. White dress, Catholic ceremony, reception at the nicest hotel in town. Marcus had insisted on paying for everything, brushing aside her parents' attempts to contribute with gracious magnanimity that made him seem even more wonderful. "She's my princess," he had told her father during the planning. "Nothing's too good for my princess." Sarah had loved being his princess, at least at first. She loved the way he opened doors for her, ordered for her at restaurants, made decisions about their social calendar without bothering her with the details. After years of handling everything herself, school, work, family obligations, it felt luxurious to let someone else take control. The first crack in the fairy tale had appeared 3 months after the wedding, during a dinner party at Marcus's sister's house. Sarah had been telling a story about a particularly difficult surgery she had assisted with at the clinic, animated and proud of her work, when Marcus had interrupted her mid-sentence. "Nobody wants to hear about your job, babe. It's gross and boring." The conversation had moved on immediately, but Sarah had felt the sting of dismissal like a slap. Later that night, when she tried to talk to Marcus about it, he had been genuinely confused by her hurt. "I was trying to save you from embarrassing yourself," he explained, pulling her close, with hands that felt more possessive than comforting. "You get too excited about work stuff and people tune out. I'm just looking out for you, princess." It had been easier to believe him than to examine the implications of what he was saying. Marcus knew about social situations in a way that Sarah, with her modest background and introverted nature, didn't. If he thought she was being inappropriate, maybe she was. The second crack had come when she mentioned wanting to visit her college roommate in Denver for a weekend. Marcus had frowned, not with anger, but with the kind of concerned confusion usually reserved for children who suggest something dangerous. "Why would you want to do that? You have everything you need here." "I just miss her. We were close in college, and I haven't seen her since the wedding." "Sarah," Marcus had taken her hands, his expression serious, "I love that you're loyal to old friends, but you're a married woman now. Your priorities should be different. Besides, Jessica was always jealous of you. I could see it at the wedding. She was practically green watching you walk down the aisle." Sarah had tried to argue, but Marcus had evidence. Jessica had been quiet during the reception, had left early without saying goodbye properly, had been slow to respond to Sarah's calls and emails since the wedding. When viewed through Marcus's lens, these things looked like jealousy and resentment rather than the natural drift that often happens when friends' lives take different paths. "I just think you deserve better than friends who can't be happy for your success," Marcus had concluded, and Sarah had found herself nodding along despite the hollow feeling in her chest. The cracks had multiplied gradually, so slowly that Sarah hadn't noticed the pattern until much later. Marcus always had reasonable explanations for why her friendships were unhealthy, why her job was stressing her out unnecessarily, why her parents' input on their decisions was misguided. He was protecting her, helping her see situations more clearly, guiding her toward better choices. By their first anniversary, Sarah's world had shrunk to the size of their marriage. She worked, came home, and devoted herself to being the wife Marcus deserved. She cooked elaborate meals, kept their house spotless, and accompanied him to social events where she smiled and nodded and let him speak for both of them. "You're so lucky," Marcus's female colleagues would tell her at company parties. "He adores you. Look how he takes care of everything." Sarah had felt lucky most of the time. Marcus handled their finances, their social calendar, their major decisions with competence that left her free to focus on smaller domestic concerns. When she occasionally felt restless or lonely, she reminded herself that this was what successful marriages looked like: partnership, division of labor, trust. The first time Marcus hit her, it had been so shocking that her mind had refused to process what had happened for several seconds. They had been arguing about money. Sarah wanted to send her parents a check to help with her father's medical bills, and Marcus thought it was fiscally irresponsible. "We can't afford to subsidize your parents' poor planning," he had said, his voice taking on the edge that had become increasingly common over the past months. "It's my money, too," Sarah had replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. The slap had knocked her backward into the kitchen counter, the sound echoing through their house like a gunshot. Marcus had stared at his hand as if it belonged to someone else, his face cycling through shock, horror, and something that might have been excitement. "Jesus, Sarah, look what you made me do." The apology had come immediately, along with tears, promises, explanations about work stress and financial pressure. He had held her while she cried, stroking her hair and whispering endearments that felt like prayers. It had been an aberration, a moment of weakness from a man under enormous pressure to provide for his family. Sarah had forgiven him because the alternative, admitting that her marriage was fundamentally broken, that the man she loved was capable of violence, was unthinkable. She had made vows, built a life, invested her entire identity in being Marcus Rodriguez's wife. One mistake couldn't undo all of that. But it hadn't been one mistake. The violence had escalated gradually, each incident followed by longer apologies and grander gestures of remorse. Marcus would disappear for hours and return with jewelry, flowers, weekend trips to expensive hotels. He would cry genuine tears and promise that it would never happen again, that he was getting help, that she was the most important thing in his life. "I don't deserve you," he would whisper against her hair, while she lay stiff in his arms, her ribs aching from the latest accident. "You're so good, so pure. I'm lucky you put up with a bastard like me." The worst part hadn't been the physical pain, though that had been considerable. The worst part had been the way Marcus had convinced her that she was complicit in her own abuse. If she hadn't provoked him, if she had been more understanding of his stress, if she had just listened to him instead of being stubborn, then none of it would have happened. Sarah had started to see herself through Marcus's eyes. Difficult, ungrateful, lucky to be loved despite her flaws. When he criticized her cooking, her appearance, her conversation skills, she heard truth instead of cruelty. When he isolated her from friends and family, she convinced herself it was because their love was special, exclusive, too profound for outsiders to understand. The woman who had once dreamed of opening her own business gradually disappeared, replaced by someone who apologized for existing and grateful for any scrap of kindness. Sarah's world had become a funhouse mirror where abuse looked like love, control looked like care, and her own perceptions couldn't be trusted. Now, sitting in her car outside the courthouse on the second day of her civil trial, Sarah marveled at the woman she had been during those 3 years. Not with judgment. She understood now that trauma had its own logic, that survival sometimes required accepting unacceptable realities, but with a kind of archaeological fascination. That woman felt like a distant ancestor, connected to her present self by DNA and shared memories, but fundamentally different in every way that mattered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Even after the divorce was finalized, Sarah had spent months expecting Marcus to change his mind, to come back with another apology and another promise to be better. She had kept her phone charged in nearby, just in case he called. She had driven past their old house sometimes, wondering if he missed her, if he was eating properly, if he had found someone new to take care of him. It had taken 6 months of therapy with Dr. Amanda Torres, a soft-spoken woman with wise eyes and an infinite capacity for patience, before Sarah began to understand that love wasn't supposed to hurt, that healthy relationships didn't require you to disappear into another person's shadow, that the voice in her head telling her she was worthless and damaged had never been her own voice at all. Trauma isn't just about what happened to you, Dr. Torres had explained during one of their early sessions. It's about what you had to believe about yourself to survive what happened. Recovery means learning to separate your true self from the story trauma told you about who you are.
Sarah had cried for weeks during those early therapy sessions, mourning not just the marriage she had lost, but the woman she had been before Marcus. The confident veterinary student who had known her own mind, the daughter who had called her parents every Sunday just to chat, the friend who remembered birthdays and showed up with soup when people were sick. Slowly, painstakingly, Sarah had begun to reclaim pieces of that woman. She had started small, choosing her own clothes instead of wearing what Marcus would have liked, eating foods he had disliked, listening to music he had dismissed as immature. Each choice had felt monumental, a declaration of independence from a man who no longer had any official power over her life, but whose voice still echoed in her thoughts. The job at the veterinary clinic had been crucial to her recovery. Dr. Pearson had hired her despite her 2-year gap in employment, and working with animals had reminded her of who she had always wanted to be. Animals didn't lie, didn't manipulate, didn't make her question her own perceptions. A frightened dog was simply frightened, not playing games or testing boundaries. A sick cat needed care and attention, not judgment about whether its suffering was real or manufactured for sympathy. Sarah had thrown herself into her work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to rebuild an identity from scratch. She stayed late to comfort animals after surgery, volunteered for weekend shifts, and studied constantly to make up for the skills she had lost during her marriage. The focus required to assist in delicate procedures left no room for self-doubt or second-guessing. She had to be present, competent, reliable. Her colleagues at the clinic had become her first new friendships in years. They were a diverse group. Dr. Pearson with his dry humor and genuine love for animals, Maria the receptionist who brought homemade tamales for lunch and shared pictures of her grandchildren, and Jake, the younger vet tech who was working his way through veterinary school and treated Sarah like a respected colleague rather than a fragile victim. "You've got good instincts," Dr. Pearson had told her after she successfully calmed an aggressive rescue dog during a difficult examination. "You read animals well. That's not something you can teach." The compliment had meant more to Sarah than any praise she had received during her marriage. It was specific, professional, based on observable skills rather than her appearance or her willingness to please. It reminded her that she had value beyond her relationship to other people. But even as Sarah built a new life, Marcus had remained a constant shadow. He had contested every aspect of their divorce proceedings, forcing her to relive their marriage in depositions and mediation sessions. He had convinced their mutual friends that Sarah was mentally unstable, spreading stories about her episodes and his attempts to help her. Most painfully, he had systematically turned her family against her with a campaign of concerned phone calls and visits that painted him as the worried ex-husband and her as the daughter who refused to get help.
"I'm worried about Sarah," he would tell her mother during their regular coffee meetings. "She's been saying crazy things about me, making up stories. I think the stress of the divorce has made her depression worse." Marcus had always been charming with her parents, but during their marriage, Sarah had assumed it was natural affection for his in-laws. Now she understood it had been strategic, an investment in future credibility. He had spent 3 years positioning himself as the responsible, caring son-in-law. So when their marriage ended, her parents' loyalty defaulted to him rather than to their own daughter. The betrayal of her family had cut deeper than the abuse itself. Sarah could understand, intellectually, why Marcus had hurt her. He was damaged, controlling, capable of violence when his authority was challenged. But her parents' abandonment felt incomprehensible. These were the people who had raised her, who had taught her to stand up for herself, who had celebrated every milestone of her life. How could they look at the medical records, the photographs, the documented evidence of abuse, and choose to believe her ex-husband over their own child? Abusers are very skilled at impression management, Dr. Torres had explained. They present differently to different audiences. Your parents see the Marcus who brings your mother flowers and helps your father with home repairs. They've never seen the Marcus who broke your ribs. But they've seen the evidence. They know what he did to me. They know what you've told them he did, but accepting that would mean accepting that they failed to protect you, that they were fooled by someone living in their daughter's house, it's psychologically easier for them to believe that you're confused or lying than to confront their own guilt and complicity. The explanation had made sense, but it hadn't made the pain any less acute. Sarah had lost not just her marriage, but her entire family system, leaving her to navigate her recovery alone, except for the professional support she paid for and the tentative friendships she was slowly building. Now, 2 years later, Sarah felt stronger but still fragile, like a bone that had healed but might break again if stressed in the wrong way. She had learned to trust her own perceptions again, to recognize gaslighting and manipulation, to set boundaries with people who didn't respect her autonomy. But the upcoming court case felt like the ultimate test of her recovery. Could she stand in front of a judge and her parents and Marcus himself and tell her truth without wavering? Could she maintain her composure when Marcus inevitably tried to undermine her credibility with the same tactics that had worked during their marriage? Could she finally prove, to herself as much as to anyone else, that she was worthy of belief and protection? Sarah checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, adjusting her grandmother's necklace, a simple gold chain with a small Virgin of Guadalupe pendant that had been blessed by the priest at her childhood church. Abuela Elena had worn it every day for 60 years, through poverty and prosperity, heartbreak and joy, until arthritis made it too difficult to manage the tiny clasp. "For strength, mija," her grandmother had whispered to Sarah when she passed it to her during her final illness. "When the world tries to make you small, you remember who you are. You remember the blood in your veins, the prayers of the women who came before you." Sarah had worn the necklace every day since the divorce, a tangible reminder of her heritage and her worth. Today it felt especially precious, a talisman against the voices that would try to convince her she was crazy, vengeful, unworthy of justice. As she walked toward the courthouse entrance, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. The woman looking back at her was nothing like the broken, apologetic person who had fled her marriage 2 years ago. This woman stood straight, made eye contact, wore clothes that fit her properly, and made her feel confident. This woman had opinions, boundaries, and the hard-won knowledge that her perceptions were valid and her voice mattered. Marcus might have turned her family against her, might have convinced half their former social circle that she was unstable, might even win today's case despite all the evidence in her favor. But he hadn't succeeded in erasing her entirely. The core of who Sarah Martinez was, daughter of immigrants, lover of animals, survivor of trauma, seeker of truth, remained intact.
That would have to be enough to get her through whatever came next. Inside the courthouse, Sarah found Janet Chan waiting by the security checkpoint with a cardboard tray of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. Janet looked tired but determined, her usually perfect hair slightly mussed from what had probably been a sleepless night of preparation. "How are you feeling?" Janet asked, handing Sarah a coffee that was exactly the right temperature and sweetness level. After months of working together, Janet had learned all of Sarah's preferences and habits, a kindness that felt especially precious given how few people in Sarah's life paid attention to such details. Nervous? Ready? Scared. Sarah took a sip of coffee and felt some of her tension ease. All of the above. Good. Nervous means you understand what's at stake. Ready means you've done the work. Scared means you're human. Janet's smile was warm but professional. Today we present our key evidence. Are you prepared for what that might feel like? Sarah nodded. They had discussed this extensively, the emotional impact of having her medical records, photographs, and personal testimony scrutinized in public, the way it would feel to see her injuries projected on screens for everyone to examine, the possibility that people would still choose not to believe her despite overwhelming evidence. "I've been preparing for this for 2 years," Sarah said, "not just the legal case, but emotionally. I know who I am now, and I know what happened to me. That has to be enough." Janet squeezed her shoulder. "It is enough. Remember, this isn't about convincing everyone.
It's about establishing the truth in an official capacity. Whatever the outcome, you will have spoken your truth under oath, on the record, where it can never be erased or denied. They made their way through security and up to the third floor where family courtroom 3B awaited. The hallway was already crowded with people involved in various cases, lawyers in expensive suits, families clustered together in nervous conversation, social workers carrying thick case files that represented other people's broken dreams and desperate hopes for justice. Sarah spotted her parents near the courtroom door, talking quietly, with Marcus and his sister Elena. The sight still shocked her, even though she had been preparing for it. Her mother was wearing the blue dress she usually reserved for church, and her father had on his best tie, the one Sarah had given him for Father's Day 3 years ago, back when they still spoke regularly and shared Sunday dinners. They looked older than she remembered, more fragile somehow. Her mother's hair was grayer, and her father's shoulders had developed a permanent stoop that spoke of weariness beyond his 62 years. For a moment, Sarah felt a surge of longing so intense it nearly knocked her off balance. These were her parents, the people who had taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework and cried with pride at her college graduation. How had she lost them so completely? Marcus looked up and caught her staring. For just a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that might have been regret or longing or simple recognition of everything they had destroyed together. Then the mask was back in place, and he turned away to continue his conversation with her father about some construction project they were apparently collaborating on. Even now, even here, Marcus was insinuating himself into her family's life. The realization that her parents were doing business with her ex-husband, literally paying him money, felt like discovering a new betrayal just when she thought she had cataloged them all. "Don't let him see that it affects you," Janet murmured, noticing the direction of Sarah's gaze. "He's trying to demonstrate his continued connection to your family. It's all part of his strategy to undermine your credibility." Sarah straightened her shoulders and followed Janet into the courtroom, keeping her eyes focused forward. Whatever games Marcus was playing with her family, whatever narrative he was constructing about their relationship, she couldn't control any of it. All she could control,
Her own testimony, her own truth, her own commitment to finally speaking up for the woman who hadn't been able to protect herself during those dark years of marriage. The fluorescent lights were still humming their persistent tune, and Judge Hendricks was already at her bench reviewing documents. The court reporter was setting up her equipment with mechanical efficiency, and the bailiff was checking his watch with the impatience of someone who had seen too many families destroy themselves in courtrooms exactly like this one. Sarah took her seat at the plaintiff's table and opened her grandmother's journal to a random page, seeking comfort in the familiar handwriting and timeless wisdom. The entry she found was dated 3 months before Abuela Elena's death, written in the shaky script of someone whose hands could barely hold a pen, but whose spirit remained unbroken. "Today I told Sarah about my first husband, the one who hit me," the entry read. "I should have told her sooner, but I hoped she would never need to know such things. Now I see the sadness in her eyes, the way she makes herself small. I recognize the signs because I lived them. Mija, if you ever read this, remember, their anger is not your fault. Their violence is not your failure. Your survival is not your shame. You carry the strength of generations. Use it." Sarah closed the journal and looked around the courtroom one more time, at the judge who would decide her fate, at the parents who had chosen her abuser over their own daughter, at the man who had nearly destroyed her but hadn't quite succeeded. She touched the silver cross from Mrs. Chen and the gold necklace from her grandmother, drawing strength from the women who had survived their own battles and lived to pass their wisdom forward. Today, she would speak for all of them. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks. The second day of proceedings began with the same ritual, but Sarah felt different as she stood. Yesterday, she had been a supplicant hoping for justice.
Today, she was a witness prepared to testify on her own behalf. The transformation was subtle but profound, the difference between asking for something and claiming what was rightfully hers. Judge Hendricks settled into her chair with the same authoritative presence, but today Sarah noticed details she had missed before. The judge's wedding ring was a simple gold band, worn thin from decades of wear. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, suggesting someone who had learned to keep important tools close at hand. There was a small photograph on her desk, angled away from public view, but clearly precious to her. These humanizing details gave Sarah hope. Judge Hendricks wasn't just an arbitrary authority figure, she was a woman who had lived long enough to understand the complexities of human relationships, who might recognize the truth when she heard it. "Miss Chen," Judge Hendricks said, consulting her notes, "I believe you're calling the plaintiff to testify today." "Yes, Your Honor. I call Sarah Martinez to the stand." The walk from the plaintiff's table to the witness stand felt like crossing a vast ocean. Sarah was acutely aware of every sound, the click of her heels on the marble floor, the rustle of papers as lawyers organized their notes, the almost inaudible whisper of her mother saying something to Marcus that sounded like a prayer or an apology. The bailiff swore her in with practiced efficiency, and Sarah placed her hand on the Bible as she had been instructed. The leather cover was warm from the hands of previous witnesses, and she wondered how many other people had stood in this exact spot, preparing to tell truths that would change their lives forever. "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." Sarah settled into the witness chair, adjusting the microphone so her voice would carry clearly throughout the courtroom. She could see everything from this vantage point. Janet at the plaintiff's table with her encouraging smile, Marcus at the defendant's table with his lawyer whispering instructions, her parents in the gallery with expressions that cycled between concern and skepticism.
"Miss Martinez," Janet began, her voice gentle but clear, "please state your full name and age for the record." "Sarah Elena Martinez. I'm 28 years old. And you were formerly married to the defendant, Marcus Rodriguez." "Yes. We were married on June 15th, 2022, and divorced on September 3rd, 2023. Janet had prepared her for these opening questions, explaining that establishing basic facts would help her settle into the rhythm of testimony before they moved to more difficult territory. It was like warming up before a difficult workout, necessary preparation for the real challenges ahead. "Can you tell us how you met Mr. Rodriguez?" Sarah glanced at Marcus despite herself. He was watching her with an expression of polite interest, as if she were a stranger telling an amusing anecdote rather than his ex-wife recounting the beginning of their relationship. The disconnection was jarring. This man had once been the most important person in her world, and now he looked at her like she was barely worth his attention. "We met at a coffee shop downtown in November 2021. I had forgotten my wallet, and he offered to pay for my coffee." "What was your impression of him at that time?" "He seemed kind, generous, charming. He was well-dressed, confident, successful. I was working 2 jobs and going to school, so meeting someone who seemed so stable and established felt—" Sarah paused, searching for the right words. "It felt like a gift." "When did you begin dating?" "He asked for my number that day, and we went out for dinner that weekend." "How long did you date before getting engaged?" 6 months. Sarah heard someone in the gallery make a soft sound of disapproval, probably Marcus's sister Elena, who had always maintained that Sarah had trapped her brother into a hasty marriage. The narrative had been carefully constructed. Sarah as the gold digger who had manipulated a successful man into marriage, then turned vindictive when the relationship failed. "Looking back," Janet continued, "do you feel 6 months was sufficient time to get to know Mr. Rodriguez before making such a commitment?" David Castellanos objected to the question as speculative, but Judge Hendricks allowed it with the caveat that Sarah should base her answer on facts rather than opinions. "I thought I knew him, but I realized now that the person I fell in love with was a performance. He showed me exactly what he thought I wanted to see. Can you explain what you mean by that? Sarah took a breath, drawing on the hours of preparation she had done with Janet and the insights she had gained through therapy. Marcus was very good at reading people and giving them what they wanted. With me, he played the role of the protective, successful man who would take care of everything. With my parents, he was the respectful son-in-law who valued family traditions. With his friends, he was the fun-loving guy who worked hard and played hard. It took me a long time to realize that none of those versions were completely real. When did you first notice concerning behavior from Mr. Rodriguez? This was the moment Sarah had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. The courtroom was completely silent, even the usual sounds of people shifting in their seat.
Rustling papers had stopped. Everyone was waiting to hear how the fairy tale had begun to unravel. About 3 months after the wedding, we were at a dinner party at his sister's house, and I was telling a story about work, about a surgery I had assisted with that day. Marcus interrupted me and said nobody wanted to hear about my gross and boring job. Sarah glanced at Elena Rodriguez in the gallery. Elena's expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the recognition in her eyes. She remembered that dinner party, remembered the uncomfortable silence that had followed Marcus's comment. How did that make you feel? Embarrassed, confused. I loved my work, and I thought he respected it. When I tried to talk to him about it later, he said he was trying to save me from embarrassing myself, that I got too excited about work and people tuned out. Did you believe him? I wanted to. Marcus was more socially sophisticated than I was, more comfortable in those kinds of settings. I thought maybe he was right, that I needed to learn when to share and when to stay quiet. Janet nodded, making a note on her legal pad. They had discussed this phenomenon extensively, how abusers often position themselves as helpful critics, convincing their victims that cruelty was actually kindness. Were there other incidents like this during the early months of your marriage? Yes. Gradually, Marcus began to have opinions about everything. My clothes, my friends, my family relationships, how I spent my free time. He always presented it as concern or helpful advice. But the message was clear. I wasn't making good choices on my own. Can you give us a specific example? Sarah's hands tightened on the arms of the witness chair. I wanted to visit my college roommate in Denver for a weekend. Marcus said it was inappropriate for a married woman to travel without her husband, and that Jessica, my roommate, was jealous of my marriage and trying to cause problems between us. Did you go on the trip? No. Marcus made it seem like going would be a betrayal of our marriage. I canceled the trip and gradually lost touch with Jessica entirely. This pattern had repeated itself with every friendship Sarah had tried to maintain. Marcus always had reasonable-sounding explanations for why her friends were bad influences, why her family's advice was misguided, why her interests and activities were somehow inappropriate or unhealthy. Ms. Martinez, when did Mr. Rodriguez first become physically violent with you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel Marcus's attention sharpen, could sense her parents leaning forward slightly in their seats. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. February 18th, 2023. We were arguing about money. I wanted to help my parents with some medical bills, and Marcus said we couldn't afford it. What exactly happened during this argument? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to remember that night in full detail. I told him it was my money too, that I should have a say in how we spent it. He slapped me across the face hard enough to knock me backward into the kitchen counter. The courtroom was so quiet that Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning system and the faint sound of traffic from the street outside. She opened her eyes and looked directly at her parents, willing them to see the truth in her face.
What was Mr. Rodriguez's reaction after he hit you? He seemed shocked, like he couldn't believe what he had done. He apologized immediately, said it was stress from work, that he had never hit anyone before and would never do it again. Did you believe him? I wanted to. The Marcus I had married wasn't someone who would hurt me, so I convinced myself it was an aberration, a moment of weakness from someone under pressure. But it wasn't an isolated incident, was it?
No. Sarah's voice was steady now, strengthened by the relief of finally telling this story in full. The violence escalated over the next year. It became more frequent, more severe, and Marcus became more skilled at hiding the evidence. Janet walked Sarah through the progression of abuse methodically, establishing a timeline that corresponded with medical records and police reports. Each incident was presented factually, without emotional embellishment, but the cumulative effect was devastating. The broken ribs that Marcus claimed happened when Sarah fell down the stairs, but which showed impact patterns consistent with being kicked. The black eyes that he attributed to her clumsiness, but which Dr. Martinez had documented as defensive injuries. The concussion that had left Sarah dizzy and nauseous for weeks, which Marcus explained to her family as a bike accident that Sarah was too embarrassed to discuss. Miss Martinez, Janet said, approaching the timeline's climax, can you tell us about the incident that led to your decision to file for divorce? Sarah had known this question was coming, had practiced her answer until she could deliver it without breaking down, but her heart still raced as she prepared to relive that final night. It was August 15th, 2023. Marcus came home late from what he said was a work dinner, but he smelled like perfume and alcohol. When I asked about it, he became enraged. He said I was paranoid, jealous, that I was lucky he came home at all given how pathetic and needy I had become. Then what happened? I tried to walk away from the argument, but he grabbed my arm and spun me around. When I tried to pull away, he hit me across the face with the back of his hand. I fell and hit my head on the coffee table. Sarah could see her mother's hand pressed to her mouth in the gallery, but she couldn't tell if the gesture was shock or skepticism. I was unconscious for several minutes. When I came to, Marcus was gone. I drove myself to the emergency room. That was the visit where Dr. Martinez treated you? Yes, she was the first person to use the words domestic violence to describe what was happening to me. How did that feel? Terrifying, liberating. Finally having a name for what I was experiencing made it real in a way that I couldn't deny anymore. Janet introduced the medical records from that night, photographs of Sarah's injuries, Dr. Martinez's notes about the suspicious nature of the wounds, the detailed documentation that had been crucial to building their case. Miss Martinez, during your marriage, did you ever fight back against Mr. Rodriguez's violence? This was a strategic question, designed to address one of the defense's likely arguments. Abusers often claim that their victims were equally violent, that the relationship was mutually abusive rather than one-sided. No, I was afraid that fighting back would make him angrier, would escalate the violence. I focused on trying to avoid triggering his rages. Did you ever call the police during these incidents?
Twice, neighbors called because they heard disturbances. But by the time the police arrived, Marcus had calmed down and convinced them that I was having mental health episodes. He was very good at presenting himself as the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. Sarah remembered those police visits with painful clarity. Both times, the officers had been more sympathetic to Marcus, clean-cut, articulate, clearly successful, than to Sarah, who had been crying, possibly injured, and struggling to explain what had happened in a way that made sense. The officers seemed to believe him, Sarah continued. They gave me pamphlets about mental health resources and suggested that Marcus might want to consider having me evaluated. The victim blaming inherent in those police visits had been almost as traumatic as the abuse itself. Sarah had called for help and been treated like the problem that needed solving. Miss Martinez, why didn't you leave the marriage sooner? It was the question everyone asked, the one that seemed to imply that staying was a choice rather than a survival strategy. Sarah had prepared for it extensively, knowing that her credibility might depend on how well she could explain the psychology of abuse to people who had never experienced it.
Leaving felt more dangerous than staying. Marcus had convinced me that I was mentally unstable, that no one would believe me if I tried to tell them what was happening. He controlled our finances, our social connections, even my relationship with my family. I had nowhere to go and no resources to start over. Did Mr. Rodriguez explicitly threaten you if you tried to leave? Yes. He said that if I ever tried to divorce him, he would make sure everyone knew how crazy I was. He said he would tell my family and my employer that I was mentally ill and dangerous. He said no one would ever believe me over him. Sarah looked at her parents as she said this, hoping they would recognize the manipulation they had fallen victim to. But their expressions remained closed, unreadable. What finally gave you the courage to file for divorce? Dr. Martinez at the emergency room. She told me that abuse escalates over time, that it rarely stops without intervention. She said that if I stayed, the next incident might kill me. The courtroom was silent as Sarah finished her testimony. She had told her story completely, held nothing back, painted a picture of systematic abuse that should have been impossible to dismiss. But she could see from the faces in the gallery that Marcus's version of events still had believers. When David Castellanos rose for cross-examination, his expression was sympathetic rather than aggressive. He had clearly decided that attacking Sarah directly would backfire, that he needed to undermine her credibility more subtly. Miss Martinez, I'm sorry for what you've gone through. Mental health struggles are nothing to be ashamed of. Janet objected to the characterization, but Castellanos had already planted the seed. By leading with sympathy for her mental health struggles, he was reinforcing the narrative that Sarah was psychologically unstable. Miss Martinez, isn't it true that you were diagnosed with depression and anxiety during your marriage? Yes, but those conditions developed as a result of the abuse I was experiencing. But you were taking medication for these conditions. Yes. And these medications can affect memory, perception, judgment. Sarah felt the familiar trap closing around her. Any acknowledgement of mental health treatment would be used to undermine her credibility, but denying it would be lying under oath.
The medications helped stabilize my mood after trauma. They didn't make me delusional or unable to distinguish reality from fiction. Miss Martinez, isn't it true that you have a history of self-harm? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never engaged in self-harm, had never been diagnosed with any condition that would suggest such behavior. But she could see where Castellanos was going. If he could establish even the possibility of self-harm, he could explain away all of her injuries. No, that's not true. But you did injure yourself on multiple occasions during your marriage. I was injured by my husband. According to your own testimony, you were often confused, dizzy, on medication that affected your cognitive function. Isn't it possible that you simply don't remember these incidents accurately? It was a masterful piece of gaslighting, and Sarah recognized it immediately. Castellanos was using her own trauma symptoms, the confusion and disorientation that followed concussions and psychological abuse, to suggest that she couldn't trust her own memories. My memories of being abused are completely clear and accurate. Miss Martinez, you've testified that you loved Mr. Rodriguez. If he was truly abusing you, why would you continue to love someone who was hurting you? The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how trauma bonds work, but Sarah knew that many people in the courtroom would share that confusion. The idea that victims could continue to love their abusers seemed contradictory to those who had never experienced psychological manipulation. Abuse doesn't happen in isolation, Sarah explained. Marcus was also kind, charming, apologetic. He convinced me that the violence was my fault, that if I just tried harder to be a better wife, it would stop. Love and fear can exist at the same time, especially when someone has systematically destroyed your ability to trust your own perceptions.
Castellanos continued his cross-examination for another hour, picking apart details of Sarah's timeline, questioning her motivations for filing the lawsuit, suggesting that she was motivated by financial gain rather than justice. He was skilled at planting doubt without making overt accusations, allowing the jury of public opinion to draw their own conclusions. When Sarah finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt drained but oddly triumphant. She had told her truth completely and under oath. Whatever happened next, she had finally used her voice and the way she should have years ago. But the day was far from over. Janet called Dr. Torres, Sarah's therapist, to testify about the psychological patterns consistent with domestic abuse. Dr. Torres was an excellent witness, calm, professional, able to explain complex psychological concepts in accessible terms. Domestic abuse is characterized by a pattern of coercive control. Physical violence is often just one component of a larger system designed to dominate and isolate the victim. Can you explain what you mean by coercive control? It includes financial control, social isolation, psychological manipulation, and threats. The goal is to make the victim completely dependent on the abuser for their sense of reality and self-worth. Under Janet's questioning, Dr. Torres described the timeline of Sarah's recovery, the ways her symptoms were consistent with trauma rather than mental illness, and the progress she had made in rebuilding her life after leaving the abusive relationship.
But during cross-examination, Castellanos managed to characterize therapy as evidence of mental instability rather than recovery. He suggested that Dr. Torres was biased in favor of her patient, that her testimony was advocacy rather than objective medical opinion. The afternoon brought testimony from Maria Santos, the veterinary receptionist who had witnessed Sarah's decline during her marriage. Maria was nervous on the witness stand, but determined to tell the truth about what she had observed. Sarah changed during that last year, Maria testified. She used to be confident, funny, always asking about our families and remembering birthdays, but she became withdrawn, jumpy. She would flinch if someone approached her from behind. Did you ever ask Ms. Martinez about these changes? I tried, but she would just say she was tired or stressed about work. Once, I saw fingerprint bruises on her arm and asked if she was okay. She made up some story about helping Marcus move furniture. David Castellanos' cross-examination of Maria was brief but effective. He characterized her observations as workplace gossip and suggested that she was speculating about private matters she couldn't possibly understand. The day's final witness was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the emergency room physician who had treated Sarah during her final hospital visit. Dr. Martinez was unshakable in her testimony, clearly explaining why Sarah's injuries were consistent with intentional violence rather than accidents. The pattern of bruising, the location of fractures, the defensive wounds on her arms, everything was consistent with domestic violence, Dr. Martinez testified. I've treated thousands of accident victims, and these injuries were distinctly different. But even Dr. Martinez's expert testimony couldn't overcome the fundamental challenge Sarah faced. Marcus had spent 2 years after their divorce carefully constructing an alternative narrative, while Sarah had been focused on healing rather than reputation management. As court adjourned for the day, Sarah felt the weight of how much work remained ahead of them. They had presented compelling evidence of systematic abuse, but the audience that mattered most, her parents, still seemed unconvinced. Outside the courthouse, Sarah watched her parents walk to Marcus's truck. Her father was limping slightly, a new development that suggested his health problems were worsening. Her mother looked older, more fragile than Sarah remembered. These were people who had sacrificed enormously to give their daughter opportunities they had never had, and now they couldn't even look at her without suspicion and disappointment. Tomorrow we'll present the documentation evidence, Janet said, joining Sarah on the courthouse steps. Financial records showing how he controlled your access to money, phone records demonstrating the pattern of harassment after the divorce,
testimony from the neighbors who called police. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the small group gathered around Marcus's truck. Elena Rodriguez was showing her mother something on her phone, probably photos of her children, Sarah's would-be nieces and nephews whom she had never been allowed to know. Father Rodriguez from St. Mary's was there too, his presence lending moral authority to Marcus's version of events. The character witnesses tomorrow will be crucial. We need to show that you're not the unstable person they're portraying, that your current life demonstrates recovery and stability. But Sarah wasn't thinking about strategy anymore. She was thinking about the last time she had spoken to her mother, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Rosa had called to ask if Sarah was ready to apologize to Marcus and start healing the family. "Mija, he loves you. Yes, he made mistakes, but he's getting help. Father Rodriguez is counseling him. He wants to make things right."
Sarah had tried to explain that the problem wasn't Marcus's need for counseling, it was his systematic pattern of abuse and manipulation. But her mother had cut her off. "You're sick, Sarah. This anger, these stories you're telling about Marcus, it's not healthy. We're worried about you." The conversation had ended with Rosa hanging up, and they hadn't spoken since. 6 months of silence between a mother and daughter who had once talked every day. Now, watching her parents drive away with the man who had nearly killed their daughter, Sarah felt the full weight of everything she had lost. The lawsuit might vindicate her legally, but it wouldn't restore her family. Marcus had won that battle years ago when he had convinced them that their daughter was the problem and he was the solution. Janet drove Sarah home in companionable silence, both women lost in their own thoughts about the day's testimony and what lay ahead. The evening news was probably already covering the case. It had drawn media attention because of the dramatic allegations and the family dynamics involved. Sarah wondered how she was being portrayed, whether the coverage would focus on the evidence of abuse or the more sensational aspects of a family torn apart. At her apartment, Sarah found Mrs. Chen waiting on the front steps with a covered dish that smelled like heaven. "How did it go, Mija?" the old woman asked, studying Sarah's face with the sharp eyes of someone who had learned to read human nature through decades of surviving difficult men. "Hard, but I told my truth." "Good. Truth is like water. It always finds a way through the cracks. You eat now. Tomorrow you need strength for more truth-telling." Mrs. Chen's pozole was exactly what Sarah needed. Rich, warming, made with the kind of love that expected nothing in return. They ate together in Sarah's small kitchen, the old woman sharing stories about her second husband, the kind man who had died too young, but had shown her what love was supposed to look like. "He never made me afraid," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Never made me small. When I cooked, he said thank you. When I spoke, he listened. When I cried, he held me without asking why. That's how I knew the difference." After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah sat on her couch with her grandmother's journal, reading entries from the year before Abuela Elena's death. The handwriting was shakier in these final entries, but the wisdom was crystalline. "Rosa called today worried about Sarah's marriage. She says Marcus is concerned about Sarah's mental health, that she's been acting strange. But I remember the signs from my own first marriage, the way she holds herself now like she's trying to take up less space, the way she apologizes for everything, the sadness in her eyes that she thinks she's hiding. I tried to tell Rosa, but she doesn't want to hear it. She likes Marcus, thinks he's good for Sarah. Sometimes love makes us blind to what we don't want to see." Sarah closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling the weight of generational wisdom and grief. Her grandmother had seen the truth, had tried to warn her mother, but Rosa had chosen to believe Marcus instead. Even after Abuela Elena's death, even after Sarah had fled her marriage, her family continued to side with her abuser. The phone rang, startling Sarah from her reverie. The caller ID showed her friend Jessica's name, the college roommate that she had lost touch with during her marriage, who had reached out after seeing news coverage of the court case. Sarah? Oh my God, I saw the news. I can't believe. I knew something was wrong when you just disappeared, but I thought maybe I had done something. Jessica's voice was exactly the same, warm and familiar, and full of the kind of concern that Sarah had forgotten existed. They talked for an hour, Jessica filling in details about her life in Denver, while Sarah explained what had really happened during those silent years.
I tried to call you so many times, Jessica said, but Marcus always answered and said you were sleeping or busy or not feeling well. After a while, I figured you didn't want to maintain the friendship. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus hadn't just discouraged Sarah from maintaining friendships. He had actively sabotaged them, intercepting calls and creating the impression that Sarah was choosing isolation. "I'm flying out for the rest of the trial," Jessica announced. "You shouldn't have to face this alone." After they hung up, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For 2 years, she had focused on rebuilding her individual strength, learning to trust herself again, developing the skills to live independently. But she had forgotten about the power of chosen family, the people who loved her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The next morning brought a text from Dr. Pearson at the veterinary clinic. "Saw the news coverage. You're braver than you know. Take all the time you need. Your job will be here when you're ready." Another text came from Jake, the younger vet tech. "Team Sarah all the way. Let me know if you need anything." Even Maria had sent a message. "Telling the truth yesterday felt good. You're gonna win this." Sarah realized that while she had been focused on the family she had lost, she had been unconsciously building a new one. People who saw her clearly, who valued her for her competence and kindness, rather than her willingness to disappear into someone else's shadow. As she dressed for court, Sarah chose her outfit carefully. Yesterday she had worn navy blue, trying to project reliability and professionalism. Today she chose a deep red dress that her grandmother had loved, paired with the gold necklace and silver cross that had become her daily armor. The woman looking back at her from the mirror was someone her grandmother would have recognized. Strong, determined, unafraid to take up space in the world. Whatever happened in court today, Sarah had already won the most important battle, the fight to become herself again. The courthouse was more crowded on the second day, word having spread about the dramatic testimony and family dynamics at play. Sarah spotted several reporters in the gallery, their notebooks ready to capture whatever revelations the day might bring. But she also saw Jessica, sitting in the third row with a supportive smile that reminded Sarah of late-night study sessions and shared dreams about the future. Dr. Pearson was there too, having taken time away from the clinic to show his support. Even Mrs. Chen had found someone to drive her to court, the elderly woman clutching her purse with determination that suggested she was prepared to fight anyone who questioned Sarah's truthfulness. For the first time since the trial began, Sarah wasn't sitting alone. Her chosen family had gathered to witness her truth-telling, to provide the emotional support that her biological family had withdrawn. Marcus noticed the change immediately. Sarah could see him scanning the gallery, taking note of the new faces, recalculating his strategy in real time. He was skilled at reading rooms and adjusting his performance accordingly, but today the audience was more complex than he had anticipated. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks. As Sarah stood with the rest of the courtroom, she felt the silver cross warm against her skin and thought of Mrs. Chen's words about truth being like water, always finding a way through the cracks. Today they would present the documentary evidence that Marcus couldn't explain away with charm and manipulation. Bank records, phone logs, medical files that told their own story regardless of who chose to believe them. The truth was gathering force, and Sarah was finally ready to let it flow.
A story of survival, truth, and transformation. Sarah Martinez sat in Family Courtroom 3B, her hands trembling as she prepared to face the most difficult moment of her life. For 3 years, her ex-husband, Marcus Rodriguez, had systematically abused her, physically, emotionally, and financially. But the cruelest blow came when her own parents chose to believe Marcus over their daughter, even sitting on his side of the courtroom during her civil case for domestic violence. What started as a desperate fight for legal validation became something far more powerful, a catalyst for change that would impact thousands of lives over the next 2 decades. Marcus wasn't just an abuser, he was a master manipulator. During their marriage, he convinced Sarah that she was mentally unstable, that her injuries were accidents caused by her own clumsiness, and that no one would ever believe her version of events. When she finally found the courage to leave, Marcus had already spent months poisoning her relationships with family and friends. The evidence of abuse was overwhelming. Medical records showing escalating injuries, financial documents proving economic control, and phone logs revealing over 300 calls and 800 text messages in 6 months after their divorce. Yet Sarah's parents, Miguel and Rosa Martinez, remained convinced that their son-in-law was the real victim of a vindictive ex-wife. "I saw you at the grocery store yesterday. You looked thin. Are you taking care of yourself?" read one of Marcus's seemingly innocent messages. But taken together, these communications formed a pattern of relentless stalking and psychological warfare designed to maintain control even after the marriage ended. Sarah's attorney, Janet Chen, methodically presented evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. Medical photographs showed defensive wounds and facial injuries. Computer records revealed that Marcus had been digitally stalking Sarah, creating fake social media profiles to monitor her recovery and new relationships. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony of Officer Patricia Williams, who had initially believed Marcus during domestic violence calls, but later admitted after additional training, "The signs that I interpreted as mental instability were actually consistent with trauma responses." Even Mrs. Chen, Sarah's elderly neighbor who had survived abuse herself, testified with profound simplicity. "Crazy person don't know they crazy. Hurt person know exactly what happened to them. Sarah not crazy. Sarah hurt. Big difference." Judge Patricia Hendricks ruled decisively in Sarah's favor, awarding $150,000 in damages and issuing a permanent restraining order. Mr. Rodriguez's behavior after the divorce cannot be explained away as concern for her well-being, the judge stated. This behavior demonstrates a continued desire to control and intimidate your former wife. But even with a legal victory, Sarah's parents remained unconvinced, continuing to comfort Marcus as he maintained his victim narrative. The painful reality was that some relationships couldn't be saved, even with court validation of the truth. Sarah didn't let her family's betrayal define her future. She used her settlement money to start Elena's Hope Animal Rescue, named after her grandmother, specializing in helping traumatized animals heal, a mission that mirrored her own recovery journey. The rescue became more than just an animal shelter. It evolved into a nationally recognized model for trauma-informed care, helping both pets and their human companions rebuild trust and find healing. Sarah's story inspired legislation in multiple states, improving police training for domestic violence responses and establishing better support systems for survivors. Over 20 years, Sarah's decision to speak her truth created waves of change far beyond her individual case. Marcus was eventually arrested again for abusing his next wife, who specifically cited Sarah's story as giving her courage to call police. Sarah's case became legal precedent, cited in 17 subsequent domestic violence lawsuits. She remarried David Williams, a teacher who appreciated her strength rather than trying to diminish it, and raised daughter Sophia to be confident and independent. Sarah,
A sought-after speaker and expert witness, helping other survivors navigate their own journeys to justice and healing. Today, Sarah Martinez Williams stands as proof that trauma can be transformed into purpose. Her animal rescue has placed over 3,000 animals in loving homes. Sarah's law has improved domestic violence response in multiple states. Most importantly,
countless women have found courage in her example to speak their own truths. The fluorescent lights of family courtroom 3B no longer haunt her dreams. Instead, Sarah dreams of animals running free, children laughing without fear, and women finding their voices after years of silence. Her story reminds us that healing is possible, that one person's courage to speak truth can create space for others to find their voices, and that the most powerful victories aren't always won in courtrooms. They're won in the quiet moments when we choose to believe in our own worth. If this story of courage, transformation, and justice resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more inspiring true stories about people who turned their darkest moments into beacons of hope for others. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that remind us all of the power of truth and the possibility of healing.